Hi everyone. Today I'll be reflecting on how I could further improve my um, assessment 3 in surveillance and disaster planning. Assessment 3 about disaster report response report, a Black Summer bushfire in 2019 to 2020. This task required me to evaluate one of the most catastrophic natural disaster in Australian history, analyzing environmental conditions, impacts, and the effectiveness of state and national emergency response. It also required me to identify lessons learned and propose strategies to improve preparedness and resilience in the future. Although I performed well in this assessment, I have reflected deeply in areas that could be enhanced, particularly in terms of analytical depth, integration of disaster management framework, data visualization, and the strength of recommendations. I'll discuss this potential improvement in detail. A key area that I could improve is depth of critical analysis. In my report, I successfully summarized the environmental and social impacts of the bushfire, including loss of biodiversity, displacement of communities, and economic costs. However, I could expand the discussion to exclude deeper evaluation of causation and response effectiveness. For example, instead of only listing that climate change intensified drought and heat, I thought analysis how policy gaps in climate adaptation contributed to the scale of destruction. I could critically evaluate whether current bushfire management policies and mitigation strategies such as hazard reduction, burning, and land use planning were sufficient, and if not, why they failed. Adding a strong evaluation tone, comparing pre-fire preparedness against post-disaster outcome would show higher outer thinking and making the analysis more robust. Um, Applying disaster management framework, another improvement that could be made, that would be linked to my report more explicitly. While I described the response effect of Australian Defence Forces, NSW, Rural Fire Service, and National Bushfire Recovery Agency, I could strengthen the theoretical foundation by aligning these actions with international recognized frameworks such as um, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030, the PPRR model, Prevention, Preparedness, Response, and Recovery, and the Australian Disaster Resilience Framework. By mapping my discussion to these framework, I could clearly demonstrate how Australia's response aligned with global best practices and were gaps excited. For example, under the preparedness phases, I could discuss early warning system and under recovery evaluate long-term community mental health support. This approach would make the analysis more systematic and academically rigorous, more using more quantitative data and visual aids. My current report include relevant statistics such as 19 million hectares burned and 33 fatalities, but I could make it more visually engaged and data driven. For instance, I could include maps showing geographical spread of fire across the state, a bar or pie chart comparing losses across sectors like agriculture, tourism, and housing, or a timeline showing the key events of the Black Summer response from ignition to recovery. These visuals would not only enhance readability but also support data interpretation, making complex information easier to understand policymakers or non specialist audience, including sources like Bureau of Meteorology heat maps or NASA satellite imagery could be strengthen the credibility and technical quality of the report. Deepening the analysis of the health impacts, the another important area to focus. While I including informations of on injuries, respiratory conditions, um, and psychological effect among responders. I could expand to these public health system resilience, for example, how hospitals and primary care services manage the surge in respiratory admissions due to smoke exposure, how mental health services reported not only responders but also displaced residents and children, the long-term consequences of air pollution, exposure on chronic health burden. Integration this level of analysis would make my discussion more comprehensive and relevant to health professionals, aligning with my background in public health and dentistry. I could also cite studies from Medical Journal of Australian Lancet Planetary Health that explores these outcomes after the Black Summer. Improving integration between sections. Although my report had clearly section introduction, part 1, part 2, conclusion, and could improve the logical flow and integration between them. For example, I could include short linking sentences to transition smoothly from environmental impacts to health impacts, from national coordination to local preparedness. In part 2, um, where I discussed the role of medical practitioners, I could tie back to another broad national response highlighting how health professionals fit within Australia's disaster management framework. By tightening these connections, the report would read more cohesively and show that I can synthesize multiple perspective, environmental, social, health related into unified narratives. I did well mention how Aboriginal culture, heritage, and vulnerable populations were disproportionately affected, but I could expand this section into include more detailed recommendation for inclusive disaster planning. For example, ensuring bilingual emergency communication in indigenous languages and accessible formats, co-developing evacuation plans with indigenous leaders to respect cultural values and community knowledge, addressing social determinants of vulnerability such as rural isolations, disability, and housing insecurity. By embedding these equity and cultural safety into my recommendation, I could demonstrate alignment with principles of social justice, which is a key graduate competency in public health disaster management. The next recommendation for the New South Wales State Emergency Service, such as creating emergency plans, promoting home preparations, were appropriate, but I could make them more actionable, prioritized, and evidence based. For instance, a list of generic suggestions, I could rank them according to feasibility and impact. Short term, within 1 year, like introduce multiple platform emergency alerts. Medium term, like 1 to 3 years, expand aerial firefighting resources and strengthening volunteer mental health services. And in long term, 3 to 5 years, invest in climate adaptation and build community resilience through education. I could also back each recommendation with examples from case studies, such as California's wildfire response from the Canada's community evaluation drills to show global perspective. Mm, Refining academic writing and referencing. While my writing was clear and formal, I could further refine the consistent academic tone and referencing. Some sentence could be rewritten sound more analytical using words like evaluate, demonstrate, critically assess, or implicate. I could also improve your referencing consistency. For example, ensuring uniform APA 7 formatting using in-text citation for all data points, including government statistics. Additionally, I could add more peer-reviewed journal articles rather than relying heavily on the website or organization reports. Then comes reflection and future application. Um, Reflecting on this assessment, I recognize that it helped to connect public health with disaster resilience and community well-being. However, if I were to improve and extend this report, I would focus on 4 key goals. Deep analysis of systemic and policy failures that contribute to the disaster scale. Stronger use of frameworks such as SENDA and PPRI. Enhanced visual presentations. More inclusive recommendations. By making these improvements, I could elevate the report from a strong descriptive analysis to a strategic, evidence based disaster management proposal that could genuinely inform policy and practice. This process also remind me that effective disaster reporting is not about describing what happened. It is about using evidence, empathy, and evaluation to prevent future tragedies and protect communities more effectively. Thank you.